Welcome to the Blockchain VC, a podcast about crypto and the digital assets ecosystem. My name is Tomer Federman, and I'm the managing partner at Pantera Capital. We invest in the most promising blockchain startups across the globe. I have more than 15 years of experience in tech, and before starting the fund, I was on the product side at Facebook, where I led product strategy and global growth of some of Facebook's major ad products. Previously, I also lived in Silicon Valley for a few years, where I attended Stanford Business School. You can find me on Twitter at Tomer Federman. Before we begin, please note that this podcast is for informational purposes only, and all the opinions expressed on this show, either by guests or me, do not reflect the opinions of Pantera Capital. Nothing on the Blockchain VC podcast represents an investment or financial advice. Please do your own research. Also, if you like this episode of the Blockchain VC and want to help bring more awareness to the space, I'd really appreciate it if you can rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. This only takes a few seconds and helps get the word out. Okay, let's do this. Excited to welcome to the show today Stephen Waterhouse, co-founder and CEO of Orchid Labs. Stephen, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Excited to be on the show.
So before we get to your background, Stephen, and how you got to start Orchid, how is life these days, with the coronavirus impacting pretty much every city in the world? Curious, you're based in San Francisco. How is it being felt there, and how does it impact your team?
Well, I think an interesting thing that happened in San Francisco is we had quite a lot of tech bloggers and tweeters who were sounding the alarm for quite a bit, especially even in January and definitely in February. And I think that we're fortunate in that it's a large tech community here, so a lot of the companies implemented work from home quite a bit ahead of the national shutdown, and so on the theory that these lockdowns are going to help prevent the larger outbreak in these regions, I think that's been a good decision. Orchid itself has always been a decentralized, remote first company. So the biggest impact to us has been really just cutting back on travel and the inability for us to hold events. So we're switching a lot of our attention to internet digital marketing. One interesting thing we have to announce is that we're making Orchid free for journalists. We're announcing that today. And so we have a program where journalists can apply through Orchid, and we'll provide them with free credits on the system. So we're excited to help, especially right now. There's a lot of concerns around increased, potentially, this is obviously potentially a good thing given the current crisis, but as we come out of the crisis, there's always a concern that some of the controls that are put in place by governments might not be relaxed.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll get to that in a second. But is there now a national lockdown in the States? Like you mentioned that earlier, my sense was it varies quite a bit, I think, between different states, doesn't it?
We have a very localized country, which you start to realize there's very specific state responses. California has been much more aggressive. There's now an advisory for the Bay Area and for California in general for people to stay in their homes or keep apart from one another. Many of us are either have been doing this for a while. I've been in my house for 11 days now, and so a number of us have taken the initiative to do that earlier. But as far as a countrywide, I'm not sure of the exact status right now in other parts of the country. I've certainly seen some photos. If you look at driving directions for any of the major cities around rush hour, you'll see that there are no cars on the road because the traffic is just zero. So there's some ways you can kind of actually spy on what's going on in the world. I think my bigger concern here is just in general, how do we, without widespread testing, which I hope will be coming into play soon globally. The question is, how do we know when to stop the lockdowns and the open the schools and so on? Like, how do we know what date that's going to be? Because so far it seems to be just a guess of, if we assume how long things lasted in China or South Korea, then we kind of use that as a metric. But without proper widespread testing, we won't really know the extent of whether we're getting less cases or more cases. And if we just increase testing from now onwards, all we're going to see is more cases. So that's not going to help us either.
Yeah. One of the things I find really fascinating is just how different governments and different regions are dealing with this crisis in a different way, right? Like you see countries like South Korea, for instance, where they just do a massive amount of tests on a daily basis. And then to your point, in other places, it's much more scarce at this point, unfortunately. So, Stephen, would love to learn more about your background and how you got to start Orchid Labs.
Yeah, sure. So I've actually been an entrepreneur since I graduated my PhD in '97. I moved out to the West Coast and was part of the founding team of a number of companies. I sold a distributed search engine to Sun in the early 2000s, and then worked on early distributed systems technology, mostly for enterprises. We were working on enterprise storage using very cheap commodity hardware at the time. Took that to market, and a lot of the learnings that I got there translated later into my work on the new peer-to-peer technology of cryptocurrency. I actually have experience starting a company in a recession. I started a company in 2008 and took it public in 2011, focused on the intellectual property space, and then was part of a team that was acquired by Fortress Investment Group. And in early 2013, when I was at Fortress, I came up with an idea to invest in Bitcoin and companies within that ecosystem, which was just starting to develop. And that initiative at Fortress eventually became Pantera Capital, which we spun out. And so for the next 3 years, I was leading investments in the venture space for Pantera Capital, and was lucky enough to work with some incredible companies, early stages, including Zcash. We were also early stage investors in Bitstamp and Circle and many other companies in that area. And in 2016, decided to leave and pursue my own ideas. Wanted to get back into starting companies, and was very focused on the concepts around security and privacy and so on. And then, rather strangely, a twist of fate, I got phone ported or SIM swapped, which is a security issue that many people have faced within the crypto space. And I was lucky enough that the attackers didn't access anything very significant for me, especially on the crypto side. But this experience really activated me into thinking through what kind of businesses would be important, and led me into looking at the VPN space quite carefully. And this was shortly after people started playing around with ERC-20s and the kind of idea of using Ethereum as the blockchain and developing your own currency. And so, inspired by these different experiences and trends, together with my co-founders, developed this idea around Orchid. We were fortunate enough to meet some great supporters, including Andreessen, Sequoia, Blockchain Capital, Naval Ravikant, Polychain, and then also internationally others, including FBG and Fabric. So over the next couple of years, we developed this idea further. And then in December of last year, we launched our network, and we were lucky enough to be picked up by Coinbase, which we're now trading on with our currency. And we've also have a Coinbase Earn program, and people can go and learn about Orchid and and get hold of some Orchid for themselves by watching videos and learning about the technology and product.
So you got into the space really early, like you said, and was part of the team that founded Pantera. What did you see back then? What drew you into this space when most people, didn't really pay attention at that point?
Yeah, it was. I've been lucky enough to be part of kind of the early phase of a number of different technologies. I was doing a PhD at Cambridge when the Mosaic browser came out and then Netscape, and hung out with a lot of early internet entrepreneurs in England at the time. And also another pivotal experience was being part of the peer-to-peer space when Nutella and Napster, which is around the music file sharing trend that started that period. And the thing I noticed in common with those experiences was that going to the first conferences, I think in New York in June of 2013, I found myself surrounded by just people from all walks of life. And the one thing they all had in common was that when they found Bitcoin, they just stopped everything and focused on it. And it wasn't just engineers; it was also.
Why was that?
Why did they stop? I don't know. But the thing.
No, I mean, like, why? I'm just curious. Back then, it was a really small group of people that, like you're saying, stopped everything and just decided to focus on this, digital currency that most people, again, didn't really care much about. What was it about Bitcoin that you think people found so exciting, and maybe you found so exciting?
For me, the general concept of decentralization, the sort of principles of the internet for me were all about decentralization at the beginning, and the kind of the centralization that we've seen over the years has always felt weird to me. And this technology, Bitcoin, came along and was promising to decentralize really some of the very most centralized systems we have in the world around banking and finance. And even then at the time, we were starting to talk about things like smart contracts. We didn't quite know how it was all going to play out. But even before Ethereum, we were thinking through how we could use this immutable ledger, this sort of essentially this write once database that's fully distributed to do different applications and build different kinds of new systems in the world. So I think that was really one of the powerful things for me. I was especially interested in the idea of building banking for the unbanked. If you think about how wireless mobile technology really leapfrogged the idea in many developing nations, the concern was, how do we get telecommunications to people when we can't lay fiber or lay cables just because of cost and development infrastructure? And if you can just leapfrog that using wireless technology, which is actually what happened, the idea here would be that instead of having to put an copy the existing banking structure, what if you could put in a completely new kind of banking structure? So that seemed to me a very powerful, very global kind of trend that would be exciting to be part of.
Makes sense. So let's talk a bit about Orchid. What is Orchid Labs, Stephen?
Well, the simplest way of thinking about it is it's a bandwidth marketplace. It's a marketplace where people are able to buy and sell a resource that they have available. In this case, for the application we've chosen initially, which is virtual private networks, or VPN. The idea with Orchid is that instead of in a conventional relationship with a VPN provider, you have a client, you're paying for a service, or perhaps you're watching ads to get it for free in some way. Although I have concerns over free VPNs. And VPNs are used extensively globally in the West. We tend to think of them as perhaps a way to access content in another country. For example, when there's a international football match, soccer match in the US, on on the BBC, I'd like to watch that coverage, but because I'm in San Francisco, I'm prevented from looking at the BBC. So I might use a VPN to access that content. In other parts of the world, that kind of content restriction is even more significant. So many parts of the world have very strict government controls. There are big firewalls, including the Great Firewall of China, that prevent people from accessing content and also, of course, publishing content. So this is not just an access issue, it's also a publishing issue for many people in terms of getting information out. And I think if you've become aware a little bit of the kind of censorship that happened in China in the early part of this year around what we were talking about earlier, COVID-19, we start to see how relevant the ability for people to access information globally and be able to publish that information quickly becomes. And on another level, we've seen a very strong trend towards government and also corporate surveillance of individuals, and using a virtual private network, especially the Orchid one, can prevent that on a number of levels.
So how is Orchid different than other VPN networks?
So the first thing that's different is that with our client, you're not buying service from Orchid, you're buying it from a network of VPN providers, each of which is advertising their services, and each of which actually gets paid eventually in our currency, OXT. So the entire network is provisioned using this cryptocurrency, the Orchid cryptocurrency, and providers of VPN services are compensated for that provision using OXT. So that's one very important difference. You're not having to use a credit card to subscribe to a service. It's also pay as you go. So you pay for the bandwidth that you use, not for a subscription model, which is unique to us. And another interesting addition is that we're able to string together multiple VPN providers and what we call multiple hops. And what this does is it means that your IP address, which is an important variable people use to identify you, is now hidden from the website or the internet resource that you're trying to access. And there's no way for someone to track for you on that particular variable.
Got it. So basically, the claim is this is even more private than using a VPN. They don't even know your IP address.
Correct, and they don't know your credit card information and so on. So,
how do you stay compliant? Because the flip side of this is governments, right, and agencies pretty much worldwide being worried that a solution like this can be used for illegal purposes.
I mean, with any technology, there's potentially different usages of it, of course. I think the way that we would put it is that we're trying to give you the VPN that you thought you were buying. And if a government, and many governments have decided that VPNs, etc., are not something that is a good thing for their society, that's out of our control.
So you don't try to be compliant or work with the government in order to make sure this is kind of in line with existing regulation?
If Apple or Google or other providers of the application are providing it, then they're in compliance, and we're obviously in compliance with those regions. But obviously, we have a certain worldview about providing these tools and improving people's ability to access content. And sometimes that worldview may be at odds to particular regimes.
Got it. And in your mind, are there different types of privacy? Like, how are you thinking about that?
Well, yeah, there's certainly different levels that you should be aware of when you're using any tool that claims to give you privacy. And at Orchid, we try to be very transparent about what our application does and what it doesn't do. But certainly across the world, there are various different techniques for people to track you. And so I think the smarter we can all become about what's going on out there and the different application level tracking or location-based tracking that could be done to you depending on who your adversary is are important things for everyone to be aware of.
Right. And how does Orchid differ from other privacy crypto networks out there? Monero, Zcash that you mentioned earlier, Aztec, and so forth.
Oh, those are all quite different things. So Zcash is providing it's got a currency which has two different mechanisms. There's different addresses you can use in Zcash, but using a Z address, you are able to hide the information about the currency, the information about the transaction that has happened. So unlike Bitcoin, where you can track everything that's happened on a blockchain, if you use Zcash, then that's not the case. Aztec's doing something quite different with zero-knowledge proofs on Ethereum. We definitely are talking to a number of people who are working on similar kinds of ideas, and I'm partnering with people as appropriate.
Yeah, and are you also ERC20 like Aztec?
We're an ERC20 token, a little bit different to Aztec. So our token is our currency is used for payment of services on the system, and then also staking. So the way that staking works in Orchid is that if you are a node provider, you stake enough OXT to basically advertise the service that you have available. So there should be some parity between the amount of OXT you're staking and how much bandwidth service you're capable of serving people with.
Did you at any point consider building Orchid on top of another smart contracts platform? Why did you decide to build on top of Ethereum?
Primary reasons Ethereum. First of all, it's got the largest developer base and support for Ethereum-based tooling and applications of anything else out there. It's also the most decentralized by design, and there are issues with building something like Orchid with a platform that, for example, a handful of people or a central entity could change in some way. So those are the primary reasons we looked for it.
Right. And where are you in terms of the product lifecycle, Stephen? You talked earlier about, you started working on this in 2017 and you're live on many exchanges with your token. What's next for you guys? And if you can talk a bit about use cases that you see right now.
So as I said recently, we've just announced that we're providing Orchid for free to journalists. So we do think that, especially in a time like this, it's important that people have access to tools like this that can protect their privacy and allow them to communicate in a sense-free way. We're working very hard right now to increase the global availability of OXT with other networks other than Coinbase. And then we're also working on making Orchid, the application, easier to use for people and different ways for people to get access to it and really improving the user experience significantly there.
And why do you think it's important at this time to provide that free access? Is it because you think some people are being censored, or what's behind this line of thinking?
Well, recently China moved to expel a lot of international journalists from that region, and then again in China we've seen a lot of censorship happen around this issue, COVID-19. I think somebody just today published a report, a transcript of an important interview that was being censored, and they published it on the Ethereum blockchain as a way to get that data out. We've seen also people translate important interviews with doctors in China, translating them into fake languages like Klingon, and even using emojis to translate the transcripts. So we are seeing this challenge right now of some governments trying to control the narrative flow and present perhaps a different picture to the reality that's happening, or things that have human rights abuses that are happening. The situation in Hong Kong has continued to evolve even during this period. And there are reports from the Human Rights Foundation of the rule of law not being respected currently in Hong Kong. I think that, unfortunately, I mean, there's definitely a proportionate response that governments have to make to enforce these new rules they're putting in place. But when these things come at the expense of human rights and when information is not being widely circulated or censored, there's definitely a cause for concern.
And what's your take, Stephen, on the regulatory environment in the US with regards to crypto? We see some companies, for instance, I had Mans Harmon, the CEO of Hadera Hashgraph, recently on the show, and he talked about how important it was for them to be based in the US. They thought it's important on several different levels, and so that's what they did. On the other hand, you see other companies, right, that are complaining about the lack of clarity with regards to regulation, for instance, Circle, and are moving some of their operations offshore. How are you thinking about the regulatory environment? Do you see progress on that front? Do you think we will see progress in the near future, or it's really tough to see something like that happening anytime soon?
Well, so we also made a choice years ago, 3 years ago, I guess, to continue to be based in the United States. And we are continuing to do that. We are expanding operations to Berlin, and this summer we'll be putting a team together there, really taking advantage of the very strong crypto development teams that are available there. I think on a regulatory front, it's a little challenging for me to comment too specifically. I think one of the things that's exciting to us, we've seen some personnel changes in the US government. Recently, Brian Brooks, who was Coinbase chief legal officer, is leaving Coinbase to become the second in command at the US office of the OCC, the comptroller of the currency. So that's a big move for the United States government to put somebody who's obviously so pro cryptocurrency friendly in a very important position. And I spent time with Brian in the past chatting about things, and I'm excited to see how that move plays out. I think that, like I said, it's hard for me to comment in general and too specifically on this issue. But I am confident that we're going to start to see a lot more clarity around this issue over the next year or so.
Yeah, you think so?
I mean, certainly in my conversations with government people in DC, the feedback that we're all trying to give them is that if you think about it from a local area perspective, it was. I guess it's been surprising to me over the last 3 years that it's the only period in time that anyone has ever said to me in the sort of 20 odd years I've been working out of San Francisco and Silicon Valley that this wasn't the best place to start a company for a particular thing. And I think that message is now starting to get through to the government that this is an important thing that's here to stay. And if we, as a country, make it harder for people to build these kind of businesses, then that's going to lead to a brain drain to other countries. And I think we've already started to see some of that happening, given the kind of global nature of crypto companies that have developed around the world.
Yeah. And how do you find the crypto ecosystem in San Francisco in general? Is it growing? Or like if you compare it, say, 2-3 years ago to when you started Orchid?
Well, I mean, if I compare it to 7 years ago when we started Pantera, that was a different time too.
Yeah.
It's gone.
I'm sure
it's gone in waves, and certainly what's happening right now is an extreme global thing that's happening. But I think over the last year or so, we've started to see companies getting past the point of just being ideas and really growing into large and powerful companies like Coinbase, for example, is based here. When you have those large, powerful companies, and in the past we've had Googles, we've had Apples, Facebooks, Twitters, and so on, the diaspora, or the people who come out of those environments after a couple of years and want to do their own thing, like I did with Pantera, they then start new things, and then they've got a group of friends who they worked with, or a network that they build, and then that's what leads to these. And this is just the history of Silicon Valley, leads to these spin-off companies that then get investment. And I think that from a conventional sort of startup history perspective, we should continue to see a healthy ecosystem, specifically on the West Coast, and also, of course, in New York, where there's a lot more finance focus and trading focus. I don't see that diminishing. I do think that one of the exciting things about the entire space is the ability for ideas to be funded kind of whatever they are and wherever they are. And we should always anticipate that a large majority of these ideas are going to end up not succeeding. And that's been the case in any bubble or investment wave. And I use the word bubble in not a particularly negative context here. We've seen technology bubbles over the entire life cycle of technology as a thing. So I can see these things both. I guess I think about it as Silicon Valley has always proven itself out to be a great place to scale businesses. It's not always the place where things are started. Facebook wasn't started here. Skype wasn't started here, but often the operations and the scaling of these businesses then happens with Silicon Valley resources or actually here. So we'll see how that idea plays out.
Yeah, that's going to be really interesting, right? My sense is right now crypto is probably more global than traditional tech, in that, of course, Silicon Valley plays an important role, no doubt about it, but I don't think it is as dominant as it is in traditional tech, right? Like, I mean, Facebook, Google, Apple, all these companies, right, are based in Silicon Valley. I think in crypto it's slightly different, but I wonder if it's going to remain that way or if it is going to skew more towards Silicon Valley as the ecosystem continues to mature. It's going to be interesting to see that. So thinking about the market more broadly, I mean, certainly in crypto terms, you have been involved in the space for a long time, both as an investor and more recently now as an entrepreneur. What are some developments or trends in the space that you're particularly excited about beyond, obviously, Orchid?
I'm hoping this year, so getting off to a bit of a punctuated start, but I'm hoping this year is a year that we start to see a couple of things happen. One is more consumer usage of applications that are crypto powered. And I separate that idea from the idea that we're necessarily having consumers be aware of cryptocurrencies. So that's sort of an important nuance and distinction. I think that the more we can kind of get people using applications that are useful to them without the expectation that they necessarily have to hold cryptocurrencies or know how to interact with them, I think that's an important step for the industry. And I'm hoping this is the year that we start to see that happening. That's suddenly one of the big directions we're going at this with Orchid. I think that decentralized finance is another interesting space. We've seen some kind of recent issues with what happened with Maker, and also the kind of the hacks / manipulation of some of the flash loans in recent months. So I think people are starting to realize that that's an important area that's got a lot of interest, but there may be some issues with the infrastructure. I think some of the companies in the decentralized derivative space will be successful there and perhaps building their own chains to solve some of these issues. So I think that's another area to look out for.
Yeah, definitely some really interesting verticals that you mentioned. Going back to the first point you made, why do you think consumer adoption hasn't really taken off yet of crypto? What are we missing?
I've always been actually pretty bearish on this idea, even back to the earliest days of looking at consumer Bitcoin applications. I think we're starting to get more familiarity today with the the use of QR codes and just generally electronic payments. Tap to pay is now becoming quite a big thing, whether it's Apple Pay or Google Pay on phones. So that's quite a big shift from where we were 7 years ago, where people were still signing for things. So we're starting to get to the point now where we may have more consumer kind of adoption of something like this, perhaps around a stablecoin, for example. So I think it's more just a question of which entity manages to get to market first. We've certainly seen messaging platforms, whether it's Facebook with a Libra platform or Kakao in South Korea, Telegram also pushing this idea of could we have a stable coin that's moved between people and messaging platforms in a decentralized way. So if one of those things hits and manages to take off, then I think that could be a next step. And certainly, as I was saying, with someone like Brian Brooks, who's really focused on the idea of a stable currency on a national level in the US, we've seen a number of governments investigating the idea of using a fiat-backed digital currency. It's not completely within my spirit of how I see these things, but it could be opening up to the idea of people using cryptocurrencies more generally.
Makes sense. What's your view on Bitcoin these days?
Well, it's still working.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
Yeah, I mean, it's like I'm intrigued.
We're laughing about it, but definitely a few years back, it wasn't clear at all. I mean, who knows how many times Bitcoin has been, written off during the years, right? Now it's almost like a joke, right? It's like, yeah, Bitcoin, of course it's here. Like it's not gonna die anytime soon.
I think it is interesting. I mean, especially with the recent price drop, which was we saw Bitcoin correlate with all other assets as everyone just tried to move to cash as fast as possible. So I think that people still have these questions of like, oh, well, we thought this was uncorrelated, but now it's not. So is it any use? It seems like every time anything happens, there's this question of like, what is the use of this thing? But in general, what I've noticed in terms of sentiment over the last 7 years is that we have gone from this question that people had to me many times in the early days of, is this thing sticking around? Is it here to stay? Is it going to be useful? And I think that question's gone away now. Now the questions are more like, well, what are these decentralized applications really going to be? And what's the first one that's going to be a killer app? So it's quite a different question now. Bitcoin as a technical store of value in the sense that it's a decentralized way to store something that can't be taken away from you is proven itself out in that use case. I guess I'm less excited about the idea that Bitcoin is the answer to all decentralized systems. That was certainly a kind of Bitcoin maximalist concept for many years, and I feel like that question has really been answered in the negative. And even like the guys in the Bitcoin core, they're really just focused on making sure Bitcoin continues to do what it's doing right now.
Yeah, and I think the more stuff like DeFi takes off, the harder it will be to make that the case for Bitcoin maximalism, right? The more we see other use cases for crypto and blockchain technology in general, the harder it will be to argue that it's all about Bitcoin. But do you think Bitcoin took a hit, with the coronavirus and Bitcoin going down so much, so quickly? Do you think like the narrative of a safe haven or a store of value took a hit, or are you still optimistic about it?
Well, I think what happened with Bitcoin over the years is that we encourage more trading in general, and we wanted traders, but traders are primarily focused on profit, of course, and so this recent drop, maybe what we've seen is a drop to the kind of store of value holders level, and that extra premium was more speculative. But it's like this. People talk about what happens during these crises, and the answer is usually that the entire system correlates and moves in lockstep and comes down at the same time. Given the quarterly easing programs and the sort of printing presses are now running again, maybe we'll see people looking towards Bitcoin as a safe harbor against that trend. But we'll see. I don't know. Hard to read the future here.
Last question, Stephen. You talked earlier about your team being distributed. There's a lot of founders listening to the podcast. Some of them have, geographically distributed teams as well. Any best practices on how you manage as the CEO? How do you manage a geographically distributed team?
Well, I think one thing that we've really tried to focus on is remembering that this is very much a human challenge right now for all of us. Whether we're spending time with our families or whether we're spending time alone. And so to the extent that in whatever organizations we're in, we can provide a sense of purpose and really a community. I think that's a lot of the things that people are missing right now. So we've initiated things like we'll just start a Zoom call and people just hang out and chat while they're working as a way to provide community. We've also been working hard to provide the team with very specific goals during this period, short term. And for example, we've also pivoted to working on desktop clients as an initiative internally. We have mobile first, but we recognize more people are connecting from home right now. So desktop clients are going to be an important part of our current focus. But I think just in general, I think it's really important for all of us to connect with one another and keep each other going during this period. It's easy to dive into Twitter and other news sources and get very scared, and the kind of the fear becomes the virus too. I can't predict what's going to happen, but I do believe we're going to get through this, and the world's going to be a different place. But we will do things again with other people, and our communities are going to survive.
I think a lot of people struggle with uncertainty of the current situation, right? Like nobody knows how long this is going to last for. A really tough situation to manage when, you don't know if it's like another week, 2 weeks, maybe it's a few months. And the other thing is, I think just the global nature of this really is unprecedented. So Stephen, thanks so much for coming on the show. Really appreciate you taking the time to share your insights, and really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it too. And everyone stay safe out there.
Thanks for listening. If you like this episode of The Blockchain VC and want to help bring more awareness to the space, I'd really appreciate it if you can rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast. This only takes a few seconds and helps get the word out.